Hello everybody and welcome back to my YouTube channel and welcome to the first episode of The Breakdown. Now if you haven't seen the introduction video that I put out yesterday, I highly recommend you go watch it. It'll give you a better understanding of what this show's about, what the other shows on the channel are about, and just general channel update things. Link will be in the description as well as in the annotations above. Now because this is the first episode, I'm not going to just start and not tell you what it's about. Basically, this is going to be my most technical show on the channel. Each episode will be taking a look at a piece of art that I find either on the internet, in a TV show, in a movie, in a video game, even in a marketing campaign, really anything that has some animation in it. We'll take a look at it and we'll try to dissect it, not critique it, but dissect it and try to figure out how they might have gone about making it, to try to see if we can learn anything from that piece of art. It's something that I like to do a lot in my free time, looking at other people's work, trying to figure out how they might have done it, to see if there's maybe a skill that I can add to my own tool belt of skills. Now for every one of these episodes, especially if we're looking at something that's on the internet, I will always be linking the piece of art in the description for you to go see if you want to. So because this show is going to be about looking at other people's work, I thought it was only fitting that for the first episode, I talk about my own work. And specifically, I want to talk about a project that I haven't really talked about a ton online. And that is the senior capstone film that I worked on while I was a senior in college. Now this film was something I worked on over the past year. We just wrapped in May of this year. I had a variety of different roles on the film, just like everyone else, because it was a really small team. Today I want to specifically dive into one of the aspects of the film that I worked on the most, and that is the look development. So if you don't know really what look development is, it's just trying to figure out what the kind of textures and the kind of look of the lighting and stuff like that is going to look for a project. It involves a lot of trial and error, and it's a really fun process for me. Some people don't like it. I personally really like it. So today I'm going to show you kind of the process that I went through on the film, working on the look development from the beginning to the end, and kind of talk about successes of each step of the process as well as all the struggles of the process. I think they're almost more important than the successes. While we're at it, I will also kind of talk about maybe some things that I wish I had done differently and things like that. So I hope you will like this. And without further ado, enough rambling, let's get straight into the breakdown. Alright, so let's dive in. Something I forgot to mention in the intro is the name of the film. The name of the film is Origin. And the look development process on Origin started really early on. Pretty much as soon as we started pre-production, we immediately started thinking about what we wanted the look development to be like. As the film is about comic book things, we were really inspired by Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. I think that movie just has an aesthetic to it and a look that we were really drawn to. It was especially the fact that it looked so much like a comic book page coming alive, and I think we really wanted to try to do that 3D that kind of looks 2D, but not necessarily use something like a toon shader. We wanted to try to kind of come up with our own solution to it. That was kind of our starting point. The first thing we did is we wanted to try to see if we could kind of add shading, specifically the kind of Ben-Day dot pattern that they have in the movie, plus the chromatic aberration they also have in the movie. We just set up a scene, so this is just like temporary items. We just modeled them just to test the look. We didn't actually use any of this in the final film. So we rendered that out and then we brought it into After Effects and tried to add the dots plus the chromatic aberration in After Effects. And this is what we got. We got a really nice kind of look. You can see we also played with some mattes in After Effects to try to make the dots appear more prominent in certain areas than others, specifically to do with how lit the area is. We all agreed that this looked really great as a still, but we wanted to try to see how that would look if we started adding movement to the camera. You can see it looks fine, but the problem is, especially at the bottom, you can kind of see that the chromatic aberration is warping a little bit, and it just doesn't look that great. And on top of this, if you pay attention to the dots kind of look like they're sliding on the surface. They don't really look like they're staying in place. It just didn't look very good. So at that point, we kind of said, okay, this technique doesn't work, so we're going to try a different method. Something that we didn't try that we could have back then is to track the footage in space to try to make the dots sit on a surface rather than composited on top. I don't know for sure if it would have worked. We would have had to try that. After that realization that we couldn't really do it in After Effects, we then decided to just say, okay, let's just make a custom shader in Maya, in Arnold, that can add the dots directly on top. This is our first try at that. To show you what the shader looks like, basically, we went into Photoshop, created a repeating pattern of dots that we then added as a texture in Arnold, and then using composite nodes, we just composited that on top of another shader. To kind of randomize it, we added a noise node to tell it to have the same intensity of dots everywhere, and you can kind of see that happening. You can also see it allowed us to control the size of the dots, which was great, but when you look at it in a close-up, it doesn't quite work for a couple reasons. The alignment of the dots doesn't look very good, and on top of this, if you look very closely, you can even see some seam lines for the repeating patterns, and that was just problematic for us because we just wanted to try to make it as seamless as possible, and this kind of took out the experience. So because we liked this method better, we weren't quite pleased with the look, but we liked the approach. We wanted to make sure that this approach was foolproof in terms of when the camera was moving, and so we then tested this with a moving camera, and you can see the dots stay in place. It doesn't do that weird warping or sliding thing that the After Effects thinks. So for us, that was a win in our books. We were like, okay, at least we know this works. So after this happened, we decided to take a break on the look development side. We had been really working heavily on those ideas. That is until I went and talked to one of my professors about it, who is really, really good at look development and texturing. And he suggested I try this node called facing ratio. What facing ratio does, it kind of creates a toon shader-esque highlight, but you have more control over the highlights because you can just use a ramp node to create the highlights that you want. And so I thought this was worth a try. So I went back and worked on a new idea. All right, so this was my first stab at trying the facing ratio node. You can see there's a lot of differences here with the previous test, and that's because a lot of things changed. The first thing is for the dots. I ended up scrapping the idea of bringing in my custom-made pattern of dots. I just used a noise node and just manipulated it to just create a grid of little dots that you can see. That would also allow me to play with the frequency of the dots to try to make them bigger or smaller as needed. On top of this, I also learned about a new node at the time called the triplanar node. It allows you to tile a texture and have the tiles be blended together so that it doesn't give like a weird seam. And the next thing that's also really cool is that the highlights are all camera based. So when the camera moved, the highlights moved with the camera, which is really great and gave us a really cool look that we ended up really making the most out of in the final film. When I showed this to the team and our supervising professor, everyone kind of said, we like this, but we feel like we're kind of losing a little bit of the three-dimensionality that other shader provided. So I took this approach and combined it with the other approach to give us this. You can see there's different materials. You can see the highlights are slightly different on the different materials. You can see we even have an emissive shader around it that has the highlights showing up as well, which is really cool because emissive shaders are really bright, so you wouldn't necessarily think that, but it was a nice little detail that I think looks really cool, especially on the objects that have emissive qualities in the film. So this is what the shader tree for that shader looks like. It basically starts with a facing ratio node that you can see is fed into a ramp, which basically tells the facing ratio what the highlight should look like. So this ramp is something that we could modify to try to, if we wanted the highlights to be closer to one another, if we wanted them to be far apart in terms of values or closer in values, we could play with the colors and the arrangement of those on there. If we wanted the highlights to kind of blend a little bit into each other. Now this is being fed into a composite node that is compositing that and a noise with the dots. With all the compositing that we have in this shader, having just one noise that's composited with the texture at the bottom didn't really quite work, so I added basically the same thing here. So it's compositing on top of the highlights and the shadows, and then you're compositing that on top of another part of the tree, which is just the ramp that's feeding the color, or sometimes we used file nodes if we had a specialty texture that was actually hand painted, and that's being composited on top with another kind of noise that creates the little like dots and things like that. The cool thing about this shader as well is that we didn't really have to play with the actual properties of the shader because we could create different looks of material just by playing with the composite nodes. So obviously if a material was more metallic, adding a metallic value in the actual base shader was very important. But if, for example, I want the shader to look more like leathery, we could play with the blend modes on the composite nodes, all three of them, to create different looks. So that was something that was really great, and we basically had one shader that we could literally slap on any object, any sort of model, and we could play with those three parameters to create different looks and materials and achieve the desired material that we wanted. I do also want to show you how the kind of highlights work, because we did test this with an actual moving camera. So the highlights are moving with the camera and the dots are staying still, and it's just a really cool look, and it kind of gives it a slight 2D look, but also retains that three-dimensionality that we really wanted. This is a great example of how this shader gave us the ability to create different materials without having to make new shaders. You can see that this is literally the same exact tree that I showed you, but just by playing with different properties, we can create 3 different looks. You have a more metallic look with the blue, the red one is more leathery, maybe more rough, and then you have a more leathery, maybe more glossy look with the dark gray. But you can see that we were really able to kind of play with that to create different materials. So to give you a better idea of how it looks on actual final models, these are 4 final models that are actually in the final film, and you can see how each one of them has different qualities and different materials. We have one costume that's much more metallic, one costume that's much more kind of glossy, one that's much more rough. You can see how the highlights, they don't really show up as much on darker materials, but you can see that they're still prominent. So basically, if I had to think about some lessons or things that I learned going through this process, it's super important sometimes to give yourself a little bit of time to think about ideas. If you're really stuck on an idea or you want to achieve a specific look, but you don't quite know how, sometimes just giving it a few days or even a week or 2 can be really helpful, because it'll give you another idea. Another thing I will also say is it's super helpful to talk to other people who do what you do. For me, talking to other students or professors, it helped me get an idea of maybe some things I could try. They didn't necessarily tell me straight up, do this and it'll help you. They might tell you how to do certain things, and then it was kind of down to me trying this thing out. If I look back to how I used the facing ratio node, I didn't use the facing ratio node exactly how my professor showed it to me. I did some tweaks, I played around with it, and figured out something that worked for what I was trying to achieve. Another thing I will definitely say, this was definitely a time when I was really happy that I understood the basics of Arnold, and I think that's something really important, especially if you do texturing, if you do look development, or even lighting. Really, if you work in 3D, I think it's super important to be familiar with the tools that you're using. For example, in Arnold, if you know kind of what each node does or what your nodes do, you can kind of play with nodes in maybe ways that you didn't know you could. Although they might not always come in handy, by just knowing your basics and how everything works, you can kind of figure out, okay, I want to achieve this thing, let me take this, this, and this from those 3 elements and put it together to achieve the look that I want. My last little advice that I learned from this project is it's okay to try things and they don't work. I can't tell you how many hours I spent working on the look development for this film. A lot of it was me trying things that just didn't work, trying something that maybe had promise, maybe taking an element from that, an element from another thing, and combining it together. It's really about trial and error, and it's a very natural process. The best advice I can say is it can be frustrating at times because you're not getting the look that you want, but you just gotta stick through it and really give yourself the chance to innovate. 3D, specifically the technical side of 3D, is very much about problem solving, and this is a perfect example. So do not give up, give yourself the time and allow yourself to go through the process of trial and error to find the right solution to your problem. So there we go, that was the breakdown of my work on the look development for the film Origin. So if you'd like to see the full film, unfortunately I cannot share the full film just yet. We are still going on a festival run and we cannot post the film online just yet because of that. But once the film gets posted online, I will be sure to make a video about it, or at least give you the link if you want to see it for yourself. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this kind of breakdown of the work, if you enjoyed this kind of format, please leave a like and subscribe for more. If you have any suggestions on maybe how to improve the format or things you'd like to see differently, please let me know in the comments. I will be reading comments. I'm really open to any feedback or constructive criticism. With all that being said, that is it for today. I will see you all for the next video very soon.